My guest today is Kim Krizan. Kim appeared in the movie Slacker in 1990, the first film by Richard Linklater, and again as an actress in the movie Dazed and Confused in 1993. Then she was approached by Richard to co-write a movie which became Before Sunrise. The movie was filmed 30 years ago this year, 1994. So this is a Q&A podcast with Kim to ask all the questions I've always wanted to know about the film in terms of the creative process and a celebration of the fact it's been 30 years since the best film ever made, in my opinion, was shot in Vienna. This is my conversation with Kim Krizan. Hey, Kim, according to ChatGPT, approximately 180,000 films have been released since 1995. Did you ever imagine when you and Richard sat down in Austin to start writing Before Sunrise that it would sit in the top 200 films ever made on IMDb, having spent most of the last 30 years in the top 100?
I have never heard that. You are the one to tell me that. I can't believe it. That's amazing. No, I had no idea. Honestly, Simon, we didn't even know if the movie would get made. And it was my first film, my first time writing a film. And when we started writing, Richard Linklater told me, let's just consider this an ambitious failure because, we knew that we were interested in writing it, but you don't know what, you know how it is. You just don't know in life what's going to work out and what's not going to work out. And sometimes you have the highest hopes for things and then absolutely nothing happens. And other times something that you didn't expect at all takes off and your life has a new trajectory. So you're the first one to tell me this number. And as for the whole thing about, technology, the timing is kind of interesting because Richard Linklater had a computer when we wrote it in 1993, but I didn't even have a computer yet and knew absolutely nothing, about how this whole thing would, we never heard the term social media and we just had no idea. So it's fascinating, really, how this whole thing has touched people around the world. It's kind of shocking.
Yeah, it's definitely had longevity, which I'm sure you could never have imagined how much. So if we start at the beginning, Before Sunrise, filmed in 1994, premiered January 1995. When did Richard first come to you in Austin about co-writing the project? I know you've said it was 1993. What month was it? Do you remember?
Well, it was 1993 when we started writing the film. It was April, but he actually told me much earlier. It was, I cannot remember the exact month, but we were working on Dazed and Confused. It actually may have even started before Dazed and Confused because when I met him, it was for the casting of his first film, Slacker. And I believe that was in 1988. And I didn't actually do a real acting performance in the casting. He just merely asked me about myself. And I told him I was working on this master's thesis about the diarist Aniston. And he seemed very interested in that. And he asked me all about that. And then he cast me in Slacker. And every time I saw him, he said, I hope you give me that master's thesis to read. So I finished the master's thesis in 1991 let's see, I got the degree in 1991. And I'll bet you that he asked me in 1991 to read the master's thesis. And I think it took me a long time to actually give it to him because I didn't really take him seriously. I just thought he was just being polite, and maybe I gave it to him in 1992 or something like that. And when I gave it to him on Monday, and he called me on a Tuesday, asked to meet me the next day, which was Wednesday, and then he asked me to co-write with him. So that may have been in 1992 that he did that. I know it was a long time before we actually started writing.
Okay, so maybe even as far back as 92. In the 16 days you spent with Richard writing the script, was the name Before Sunrise thought of then, or was there a different working title at the time?
Yeah, that was not until a bit later. We did not have a solid working title. I'm trying to remember. That seemed to solidify quite a bit later, but I love it. But I know that we didn't have that while we were writing the script, so it was a bit later.
When Richard came to you about this idea, we know now that he had this meeting of two strangers and building a connection as the theme. You mentioned on the podcast Popcorn Talk that he kind of just came to you and said it's a boy meets girl film. And he didn't mention much else at the time about what the plot might be. And you based the story on your experience meeting someone from Norway when traveling through Europe on a train. Did Richard tell you about the experience he had talking all night with a girl he met in Philadelphia in 1989, walking around the city talking, and that he told her one day he would make a film about this? Or did he keep that to himself? Because the story seems like a beautiful mix of your experience and his experience kind of put together. Is that just like a coincidence?
Well, I did not hear at all about the girl in Philadelphia. I don't, there was no plot when we got together. And the Norwegian person I met was just kind of an example of the sort of person I would meet on my travels, because I did meet when I was traveling in England and in Europe on first your Brit Rail and then on Eurail. I met a lot of different people. Um, sometimes men, or guys, and other times I'd meet some fun girl and we would go sightseeing together. And there were a lot of them. But when Rick and I sat down, there was no plot whatsoever. Um, he did say he was thinking that maybe the couple could meet. There was no plot, but when we were talking about how they would meet, he said something about, what about a toy store? And I said, well, here, I noticed that you have these finite stories where people have an experience over the course of maybe 24 hours. And I said, I think a good way to encapsulate a relationship is meeting during travel, because it's, you know how it is when you're traveling. You may meet someone on a train or on a plane or in a hotel room, let's say hotel, and you may go sightseeing with them and then have to later you say goodbye or something like that. So we I think that there's some mythology that is built up since the movie came out, honestly, about this whole thing about meeting the girl, because I didn't hear anything about that, or that he would tell her anything. That I heard absolutely nothing about that.
Once Vienna was chosen as the location, as they became kind of the source of funding, I believe, for the film, what then happened in regard to changing the script to make it fit the location, such as the cemetery of the nameless, the Prater, where they first kiss, and so on? Because now you have a film that's heavily about the location as well as the people. So when did those changes get made to the script?
Well, honestly, our script was just talking about all kinds of things. Some of the things that they talked about were pretty profound, about the past and death and, big cosmic realities. And we thought originally that the film would be shot in America. So when Rick got funding in Vienna, because I believe, he tried for funding just anywhere, but became clear that the funding would be in Vienna, it was very easy to transfer some of the conversations to the beautiful and, romantic and classic locations. Say, for example, most cities have beautiful cemeteries, or, so they have gorgeous areas. We originally thought the film was going to be shot in San Antonio, Texas, where they have a river walk and they have the Alamo, and they obviously have all kinds of things that could have, worked for a conversation. So it just so happened that, Vienna is a very romantic city. And I think that some of the conversations deepened a bit when, there was the opportunity to shoot in these gorgeous, gorgeous locations. So, in other words,
Yeah.
things may have deepened, but the basic conversation was there.
So when you last touched the script, it was kind of, or the stories, that was before Vienna was chosen, but the kind of most of the work was already done with you and Richard, and that was just kind of, you didn't have to go back and change much. It was just changes around the locations.
Well, Richard and I wrote the script, and then the actors came to Austin, Texas, for a read through with us. This was a few days of hanging out with the actors and getting to know them and talking about the script. And during that time, we were talking about various scenes and what could be deepened and what could be changed. We were taking notes, and we watched some classic movies together and talked more deeply about other possibilities. And then when I know that when Rick went to Vienna, I was still in Austin, I was faxing scenes. For example,
Oh, really?
the scene in which they meet the psychic, the palm reader.
Yeah.
I had
Yeah.
been,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I had been. I like science, and so I was reading about the origins of the universe and about how all of us our bodies are made of the materials that the the elements that blew up in that first Big Bang. And I thought, well, gosh, I've got to get that in, but I want to do it in a poetic way. And the way to do that might be through, a palm reader or something. So I faxed that. And then I'm just remembering some other bits, like, for example, the scene in which Julie tells, Celine tells Jesse that female spiders eat the male spider after they have sex with them. I faxed that because I had read that in a science article, and I thought that would be a funny thing to add. And so I was communicating via fax, which I think fax is sort of dead now, right? But that was the modern way in the late 80s and mid 90s to send information. It was really before emailing
Yeah.
and texting, right? So we thought
Yeah.
that was really advanced back then, you know.
You are Stardust. That part came from your idea to bring that palm reader in.
Yes, it did, because I thought that I love I love reading about the origins of the universe. And I like, I just like science. I like the big macro stuff in science about, like, the origin of the species and the origin of the universe. And, I love these things. And I wanted to bring that in. And I thought that the way to do that was to do it poetically. How would this come up in a conversation? Well, I thought the best way to do that might be through some sort of wise lady, wise woman, psychic or palm reader. And so, because, at the time I was quite interested in I had a tarot deck, and, these things that I was sort of exploring all that stuff back then. I had some books on astrology, and the thing that I thought was interesting about all that was that it's an ancient effort to understand where we came from. And I think that's kind of beautiful. Like all the symbols in the zodiac are kind of beautiful to me. Even though, scientifically there may be no basis whatsoever, I think that ancient peoples had poetic things of describing, poetic ways of describing how we're here and what the meaning, the meaning of things that happen to us. And so I thought I wanted to bring that in some way. And so that's where that whole palm reader lady came in.
And now, when you think about it, it's a perfect way to introduce something to a story without one of the main characters having to say it themselves. It can just be knowledge that gets dropped into them, and
Yeah.
then they can react to it one way or the other. But you still get the idea into the story. So that's a clever idea.
Yeah.
So you kind of touched on briefly that Julie and Ethan came to Austin, and then you all kind of got to know each other a little bit and talked about different ideas for the characters. Was Vienna at that point known as the location then, or is that still not known?
I believe that was known because that was in the spring of 1994, and they were going to be heading off in a couple. Yeah, I believe that may have been April, I believe, of 1994. And so they filmed that in the summer of 1994. So I believe that um, after we knew that Vienna was going to be the location, Rick told me, and we found out that Ethan Hawke had an interest in the movie. Rick said that, well, I feel like in this case we should have a European woman. And I had watched a lot of casting interviews, and a lot of the women were Americans. And but he made the decision that I think we need to have a European because it will make a little bit more sense. I don't really want two Americans to meet in Europe on the train. I think it would make more sense to have one of the characters be European, and we've got Ethan, who's an American. Let's have a European woman. And one of the people who had auditioned was Julie. We had had a number of Americans who I thought were really good audition. I mean, one of the people I remember is an actress named Lily Taylor, who was on a TV show in America called 6 Feet Under. She did a superb audition, and there were others who did a great job. But I think when it was nailed down, I don't know. I cannot remember when I saw those casting tapes, but when it was nailed down that it was a European, Rick decided on Julie because European, it makes sense that Ethan would run into her. They're roughly the same age. It's very likely that a couple like that would meet in a train car, just crossing paths in Europe, on Brit Rail.
The poem Delusion Angel, written by David Jewell. What was the brief? Do you remember what was the brief given to David in regards to that poem? Do you remember what purpose it was meant to serve in the story or for the characters?
Well, so while Rick and I were working on the film, I simply went to my friend, David Jewell. I met him a couple of years before that because I was in a little play. I was actually not an actress, but after I was in Slacker and Dazed and Confused, I did a couple of little things kind of just for fun. I was never any kind of serious actress, but I was in a play with David Jewell, and I knew that his main thing was that he was a poet. And I asked him if I could read some of his poetry to possibly include in this script that I was working on with Richard Linklater. And of course, I didn't know at that point that the film was going to be produced, but I just went through a number of David's poems, and I picked one out that I thought was sweet and seemed like it could have been written on the spot by some sort of street poet, because in Austin, it wasn't unusual to have people playing music on the street with their a little hat sitting out or something, asking for you to throw in your spare change or $1 or something like that. So it was kind of this thing that happened in Austin, and I think it does happen in other cities. And I thought, well, I thought to myself, I've also had people come up to me in Austin and say, may I read my poem to you? And if you like it, could you give me some change? And so I thought, well, this might be a way for me to get one of David's poems in there. And so the one I picked was that one. I thought I liked the sweet cakes and milkshakes, and I just thought that's the sort of sweet romantic poem that someone might make up, on the street if he ran across this couple who were obviously kind of enamored of each other. So that's how that happened.
Okay, so it was chosen because you just thought it was a sweet poem and kind of realistic as the kind of poem that somebody would write on the spot to try and maybe get a tip, basically, right?
Yeah. I don't know how many of his poems I read. I'm going to guess I read, eight of his poems and picked that one, and I just thought that one was really sweet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always wondered about that poem because it's quite deep, but and I was always kind of wondering what was it meant to mean in the story. But okay, great, thanks for that. In the morning, when Jesse and Celine are walking, Jesse remarks that he and Celine have again entered real time. Was this to symbolize them realizing that their kind of fantasy world they've created together was coming to an end, and they're kind of realizing the clock's ticking now? Was it to do with kind of a fantasy world that they were in, or what did that mean to you when he said we're back in real time? Because an element of time is kind of put into a few places in the script.
Oh, really? Okay, that's an interesting observation because I'm always thinking about time, so that makes sense. I think that in the middle of the night, your brain is in a different state. You know how in the middle of the night you have incredibly intense conversations with people. You are in a dream state. Sometimes you have amazing ideas. You wake up with some insanely, like what seems insanely creative idea, and then somehow you wake up in the morning and you're snapped back into a kind of reality. I think the brain is literally in a different state, which is why, and also there's something about being in the dark. If you meet somebody and then you're talking to them in the dark, I feel like there's almost a safety factor where you go very deeply into your truth. Whereas in the daylight, I don't know, we feel like maybe I don't know if it's biological, but we feel more like we have to be all business. We have to have our game face on. We have to, have a different part of our psyche functioning. Whereas in the middle of the night, we start telling stories and telling truths. And this is why it's so amazing, especially I think when you're a young person and you go to parties or you go to clubs and you meet your friends or you meet somebody and you just somehow you break away slightly from the party and you sit there talking about who you are. I just think these things happen in the middle of the night in the dark. And then the sun comes up and it's almost sad when the sun comes up, right? Even though the sunrise is so beautiful, there's a sadness to it because it's like, oh, back to reality now. I have to say goodbye to this wonderful night. So I think that's what they were experiencing. And that's probably what the title refers to, is how it all happens before the sun comes up, this amazing, I'm sure you and your listeners can relate. You have memories of great nights where you had some kind of incredible connection with somebody, but it was so even though you were wide awake, it was so dreamy, and it lives in your memory, but you had to get up the next morning, or wake up and go into your life the next morning, and it's like you couldn't continue in that dream state. So I think that's what it was referring to.
Kind of moving on to casting now. Did you mentioned it, you touched on it briefly, about the casting. Did you have, once it was decided American and European, and Ethan was already on board, you watched tapes of different women from Europe then at that point, right? And Julie was one of them. Were there any others from Europe that you remember that were maybe in the possible options for playing Celine?
I don't remember any others, honestly. I don't remember any others. Um, I don't know how that process went. I remember the American actresses because I was so blown away by their talent, and I don't remember. I think there are actually some myths floating around about people auditioning who I don't remember auditioning. Or it's also possible that at the time I just didn't know who they were, because they weren't famous yet. That is very possible. So, but I don't remember any other European actresses auditioning.
Yeah, I saw one rumor, and maybe you can say if it's true or not, that Jennifer Aniston auditioned for the film. Is that true? Do you remember if she auditioned for or did a tape or something?
I don't think that that's true. I don't remember her. But it's
Yeah.
very possible that the reason I don't remember is because she wasn't famous yet and her show hadn't come out yet.
Yeah.
But I do not remember Jennifer Aniston auditioning. I very specifically remember
Yeah.
a bunch of blondes auditioning, but I don't remember Aniston. Yeah, I do remember, and I remember Lily Taylor.
Did you feel personally invested in choosing or being involved in choosing who Celine would be because so much of yourself was put into that character? Did you feel like you wanted to have a bit more say in who became the actress for that role rather than Jesse's character?
I think it was important that Rick made that decision because I believe now I understand very clearly that when you're done writing, you pass off, your job is done, and you pass off the work to other people who then take the ball and run with it. It's like a relay race. And I couldn't force my way at all. And the project would take on another life, it'd take on a life of its own that would be outside of me at that point. I knew that the
Yeah.
character was based on me. I had heard from people Rick worked with that he cast Julie because the long blonde hair situation, and he thought that she was, perhaps like me. And people always told me they thought I seemed very European. I didn't seem like a typical American. And I don't know if that's because I'm literate, which is a terrible thing to say. I was a literature major and I read a lot, but I didn't at that point feel like um, I could strong arm Rick because it was going to be his baby at that point. He's going to be directing, and so he's the captain of the ship at that point.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I think also maybe people from Europe, um, they reminded some of them reminded Rick of you, perhaps because you were well traveled already at that point, and it's
Yeah.
not so common for people from America to travel so much in Europe, especially back then, right?
Oh, that's very possible. I mean, I did meet a lot of Americans traveling, but I have a particular thing for travel, and partially it was because when I was a teenager in it was the late 1970s, my father had watched this show that was a big deal in America called Roots. Have you ever heard of that show? It was
No,
it
I
was
don't think I have actually.
Okay. Well, it was about an African American person who finds out his roots or where he came from. And my father became obsessed with that, and he decided that he needed to explore his roots. And his roots were in Czechoslovakia, then Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic or Czechia.
Yeah, yeah.
And it just so happened that I got to go with him to what was then a communist country, Czechoslovakia. And it was the most incredible and mind-blowing experience. I was only 16 years old. It was 1978. It was the most astounding education I could possibly have, to go to what was then a communist country and meet my family, who did not, for the most part, did not speak English, but fortunately my grandmother did. She spoke Czech, so she could translate for us. And it was the most astounding education. So from that point on, I wanted to travel. And then when I had been at age 20, I'd been in this dreadful car accident that was not my fault. And I got some money from the other person's insurance company. And so, unlike other people who might have like bought something, special, put it in the bank or whatever, I just spent it on a plane ticket and a Brit Rail pass, so that I could go travel by myself through Britain, which, was, again, astoundingly great experience. I adored it. I loved that experience. And then later, I made a little bit of money, and I, of course, blew the whole thing on going to Europe and buying myself a Eurail pass. So I just believed in travel, and I felt like the experiences traveling alone were so enriching. And while I was traveling, everybody thought I was a European. I would have people would come up to me all the time thinking I was not an American. No one knew I was an American. I don't know why. Well, I don't know what it is about me, but they always thought I was something else. So I just love travel. You know, it's just the best education ever. And traveling by yourself is how to meet people. You meet fascinating people and you ask them about themselves.
Yeah, it takes people out of or it forces people out of their comfort zone. And
Absolutely.
you can either be lonely or you can just start a conversation and see what happens. And usually good things will come from it. So yeah,
Fascinating.
that definitely shaped your experience in a good way. And obviously that went into the script. So you mentioned once Julie and Ethan were cast, they both came to Austin, and you kind of all got to know each other a little bit for a while, worked on the script a bit more. Can you tell me like everything you remember about those days, like where you went, what you watched? You said you watched some films or something. Can you elaborate as much as you remember about that period? Because I think that period of time is not documented at all, and I think it's quite interesting in terms of how the film got shaped.
I remember we picked up Julie. We took her to an Italian restaurant. Um, we then picked up Ethan at the airport. People recognized him at the airport because he had made the movie Reality Bites. And he also, this is really funny, but just that very week, he was in the tabloids. Um, he was in the tabloids dancing with Julia Roberts. And so I think he was getting quite a bit of attention. I remember people saying hello to him. We went to a club to watch a band, but I remember Ethan was besieged with attention, and I remember it was a little bit frightening because the people were kind of pressing in, and he and I were talking, and I remember he took me into a corner and said, "Please block the way," because the people were coming at him and he was getting a little nervous. And so I like blocked him in and talked to him. Um, that was interesting. You could feel the press of people who just recognized this famous guy. He was 23 years old. Julie was 24 years old. We met at Rick's office. I remember the room we sat in. I remember there's an open window behind Rick, and we read through the script and we talked about it. We watched, I think the movie was called The Clock. I think it was a 1940s
Okay.
movie. Does that sound familiar? The Clock.
No, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay.
American film, is it?
Yeah. A 1940 black and white. I could be wrong about the title. We played ping pong. We went to a restaurant, and I think the restaurant was called Mars. And I remember and that was a very beautiful, I remember inside, it was a gorgeous restaurant. It was in these red and beautiful, it was a beautiful restaurant. And I remember Ethan was telling us about Robin Williams, because he had been in Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, and he talked about working with Robin Williams and about what a generous person Robin Williams was. I remember this was maybe like a 3-day encounter. And then there was some goodbye breakfast held in a hotel. I think that might have been in a nice hotel, and maybe it was the Four Seasons or something. And we said goodbye because we were then going to be meeting again in Vienna. So you have to remember, this was in 1994. So this was 30 years ago, and say 4 months ago. So it was a lot for me,
It was a
because
while ago.
this was my very first movie. And so it was a really crazy experience to write the thing in April of 1993 and then be getting ready to have the thing filmed a little more than a year later. I really did not understand then how fortunate I was that it's very, very difficult to get a movie made. And I didn't understand that at all. So, it was a crazy experience, and it was kind of a lot to digest. But those are the main things I can tell you right now. Yeah.
In regards to conversations about the script and the characters, do you remember anything in particular? Did anything stand out like that? Maybe that then changed something because of a conversation that was had between the four of you?
I wanted to get the female voice in there a little bit more strongly, because you had to understand, Rick had been my director twice before. And so in a sense, and even though we were friends, we became friends after I met him on Slacker, he had been, in a sense, my boss. He had cast me twice, and he had been my director. So I took instructions from him. I, as a first-time screenwriter, was just learning things. It was the very first time I wrote a screenplay, and it was the very first time I worked on a computer, and it was the very first time I learned the formatting of a script. So one thing I really wanted to get in there was more of a female voice, and I did not want to be offensive. And I think it's interesting to say this to you now in 2024, because so much has happened as far as, the female voice goes. But I felt like I needed to tread lightly while he and I were working on the story together, because there were some things that I wanted to tweak and change, but I didn't. I know that while people are creating, they're sensitive, and it's not really the time. Sometimes, I know this as a teacher, it's not really the moment. You want to wait until a little bit later to say, this one right here, let's work on this one a little bit. So I think I brought that up a bit in our meetings, and discussed it a bit with Julie, that I felt like we needed to get the female voice in there, and I had some areas where I wanted to get it in there. Like for example, the scene with the belly dancer. During that time, I had been studying belly dance, which was for me this really, it was like this woman empowerment thing, because it's supposed to be the oldest dance on earth. It's a birth dance. It's kind of in a roundabout way about female power, and female the female body as being a portal for life on the planet. And so I really wanted to get a belly dance scene in there, because I thought it was my way, one of my ways of injecting this idea. I didn't want the female voice and the feminine voice were still having a real struggle in the 1990s. Even though we had, there was a rock and roll movement called Girls. Do you know that? It's GRRRRLS. Do you know that movement?
I don't think so. Sorry.
Okay, it's okay. It was a female rock and roll movement in the United States. It was kind of an outgrowth of punk, and it was females trying to have a voice, because I don't know, people are always struggling to have a voice, right? I mean, everybody is. So I was trying to get that voice injected into the story, and I knew I needed to tread lightly and play the game so that I could get her voice in a powerful way. I wanted to stay true to myself and true to the character. So that was something that I remember I brought up in the meetings.
Thanks for sharing that. I think in the UK, our version of Girls would have been the Spice Girls, probably. That was the UK version at that time.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, because they were about female empowerment. They were, weren't they?
Yeah. And that was that's what made them blow up so big in the UK. That kind of lit something that grew and grew, and many other things happened off the back of that in the UK. So I think maybe America had your own version of that.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's an interesting parallel that you brought in. Yeah, that's very
Yeah.
interesting to me. I can see that now.
So moving on to the shooting of the film. One thing I've always wondered, Adam Goldberg, he had a big role in Dazed and Confused. How on earth did he end up being in the opening scene of the film as just a random person asleep on the train? No lines, eyes closed for 2 seconds. How did that happen? Do you know?
I think it was Julie's boyfriend.
Ah, okay. That the dots are connected. Okay, that makes sense. If you were to Google your name and then Before Sunrise, one photo that always comes up is all of you on the train platform.
Oh, okay. Okay.
In Vienna.
Okay.
The shot of you, Richard, Julie, and Ethan together.
Yeah.
What were you seeing being filmed that day? Was it the end scene of the film or the beginning of the film?
The end. It was the end scene of the film.
I thought it was the end based on how Julie was dressed.
Yeah, it was the end scene of the film. Okay, so that day, I remember showing up to the filming, and I was down the way, down the track, and I was talking to where was he, Viennese? I think I was talking to the Austrian producer, and he was, telling me about what was going on at that moment. And then someone on the walkie-talkie said, "Kim's here." And then Rick came running down the way and brought me up to see the filming of I think these were the very final scenes. I think for a lot of it, Rick really tried to keep things chronological, which is such a, it can be expensive to do things that way, but but it's great for the actors because then they're really feeling the growth of the relationship. And yeah, I don't. Somebody took those pictures. I had my ridiculous little Instamatic camera, which do you remember? Do you remember those?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so back then, so when I traveled, I would just throw a bunch of Instamatic cameras in my backpack. And we didn't take pictures back then the way that we do now with our iPhones or mobile phones. But I took some other photos that day on the set, and I've posted those photos on Instagram and things. But yeah, I took photos that day, and I remember. I think that Julie was kind of emotional that day. And Rick told me he thought she was feeling really emotional about the movie ending. So I remember saying hello to everybody, and I remember watching the filming that day. And you know how a film set is. It's like it takes forever to set things up, and you can't have a lot of air conditioning going because you can't have the noise and all. So it's kind of a film set is not as exciting as people think, you know.
Yeah, especially when it's probably 30 degrees in Vienna in the summer, right?
What's 30 degrees in Fahrenheit?
Oh, I don't know. This is if I guess, I'll forever look stupid on the internet, so I won't guess. But a lot, it's hot.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it was warm. I remember it was really warm. And I remember I just had on sleeveless things all the time. I remember it was very warm.
What other scenes did you see being filmed for the film? Obviously, you saw that day. Was that the only day that you were on set?
I did not see much else. Rick took me to the locations, and I didn't know at the time. I could not tell you. I could not remember what the names of the locations were. But he took me and to show me various locations, restaurants, um, statues, and we walked all over the place, actually, bridge and things like that. But that was the main bit of filming that I saw. That's the extended bit that I saw. Generally they do not want writers on the set. Do you know that? They don't want the
Yeah,
writer
yeah,
there because the writer, writers tend to get upset about things, and it's like, honestly, the writer they're part of the relay race is over. So it's kind of a big deal for them to be on the set at all. And so I was on the set, but I wasn't, sticking my nose into everything. That's for sure.
yeah. What did you think of Vienna? Was that your first time you'd been there?
No, I had been there before, and I think it's such a quietly romantic city. I well, first of all, it's got this fantastic history with, Freud, right? Freud was such a player there, and Klimt, I adore Klimt, and I've loved Klimt forever. And then, of course, there's the darker side, Hitler's roots in Vienna. Um, but I had been to the museum, and I'd seen the gorgeous statues. I'd been to the soccer hotel, and so I had seen it for a brief stay. This was a bit longer, but I thought it was an incredibly romantic city with it's got that 18th century thing going on. And then I think into the early 19th century that is so romantic and gorgeous. Also, my heritage, being half Czech, has strong roots with that culture as well, because they almost conquered us. So we then we held them off, and we maintained our Czech culture. But, that's interesting to me as well, because we had to fight quite a battle to maintain our Czech culture, and we almost became Austria. So that's very interesting to me as well. Yeah.
Interesting visit for you on many different levels.
Yeah.
How long were you there for when you went to when you went to see the set and you went to see some of the locations? How long was that trip?
I think that was over a week long that I was there. So it was for sort of the end period. I remember I was there at the end of filming. I saw Rick editing with the great editor Sandra Adair. I went to the big wrap party. Rick, did sort of a debrief on what had happened during the filming. I remember that he had his birthday there on the July 29th. And so I was there for, I believe it was well over a week.
So with July, that's the month it was filmed. Is it July 94 it was filmed?
Yes. And I cannot tell you the
You think?
exact day it started, but I was there
But
at the
around
end
then,
and beyond the end. Yeah.
where was the rap party?
Oh gosh, it was at some really gorgeous hotel. And I remember I had champagne that had a peach floating in it, because that's the Viennese way of drinking champagne. And I remember the beautiful dark walls, like everything was so romantic and beautiful. But that's the main thing I remember, is my beautiful old school Viennese champagne drink. That's the main thing I remember.
Okay. You acted in Slacker and you acted in Dazed and Confused, and you were on the set of Before Sunrise. Was there any hint of maybe you having a little cameo appearance in the film?
Oh, in Before Sunrise?
Yeah, because you were
Oh,
there.
I wish. That's a good idea. Gosh, I would have
Yeah.
loved. No, 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 no. But that's a great idea. I wish I could have done that. I should have barged my way in there and demanded, didn't Hitchcock
Yeah.
just walk through? I should have done a walkthrough, just walked in the
Yeah,
behind them
exactly.
or
Yeah.
something. That's a good idea. I
Yeah.
should have done it.
If Julie Delpy's boyfriend's asleep on the train, you've got to do something.
That's
Right.
right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. That I should have done something. Good idea.
In regard to the final film, um, when did you become aware that the film started to gain a big following, especially as kind of the internet started to become a bigger thing and word spread about the film? Because I believe from what I've read that the film kind of got bigger as years went on. Is that your understanding? Did you notice something or do you remember a time when you started to realize, hey, this film is still getting talked about a lot. It's getting bigger maybe than the cinema release.
I didn't start participating in social media until I got on Instagram in 2019. Before that time, someone had
Oh, wow.
created a Facebook for me that I did not go on. So when I got on social media and I got on Instagram, I didn't post about anything to do with Before Sunrise for a while. And then when I posted a little tiny thing about it, I started to figure out, oh, people still talk about this movie. So I'm going to say that was in 2019 or 2020 that I figured that out. And then I I started to gradually realize, oh, people are really into this movie. And it's been a long time.
Hmm.
At that point, it had been 25 years. And I was kind of surprised about the longevity of the film, and that instead of dying out, it was seemed to be gaining interest. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's all because of me getting on social media, which the reason I didn't get on social media is, I wasn't really the computer generation. And I really didn't know how amazing and deep it could be, because I just made the assumption that it would be a silly waste of my time. But instead, I have found that it allows for a certain sort of depth. Like for example, I
Hmm.
meet people like you who I otherwise would not have the opportunity to meet. I actually met you face to face in Warsaw for when I was there for a Before
Yeah.
Sunrise screening, and it allows it's allowed me. I mean, the world is getting smaller and smaller because we're all finding each other, and so it was all through social media, and it was all. I mean, I have to give credit to Instagram because I had no idea until I got on Instagram. I sort of had been,
Oh wow. So okay. So you didn't.
yeah, I had not known. I had not known.
Oh, okay. Um, when and where was the first time you saw the final cut, and what were your first thoughts when it finished?
I saw the final cut with Rick and a very small group of people in a theater in Austin that was screening the film in the morning before the regular moviegoers showed up for the first movie of the day. And so I was invited, and it was Rick, the producer girl, the cinematographer Lee. There may have been one other person, maybe, and me. And I remember we were all sitting kind of in the middle of the audience, just
Mhm.
us. And I
The best
remember
spot.
the best spot. And the Columbia lady came
Mhm.
on with her torch. And I remember having a little moment of shock seeing the Columbia lady who I'd seen, so many times in my life. And I thought, wow. I mean, and then I guess it became real to me. And then we watched the movie, and the quietness of the movie, the quietness and the lack of car chases and explosions and gunfights was very refreshing to me. You know, I'm not, I can deal with a movie that has those things, but it's not really my bag. I'm more about subtlety. And I remember seeing a number of things that I was like, yes, I got that in there. I got the palm reader in there. Yes, because I faxed that scene, right? And I was like, yes, they got the spider thing in there because I faxed that scene. So there were a number of things that I was thinking, oh yeah. Um, and then it wrapped up, and I remember feeling like, oh, I like it a lot. I really, I like it. I mean, I don't know what other people are going to feel, but this is something I've come to realize is very important, is that when you do any kind of anything, like you do a podcast, you do a work of art, a painting, whatever you do in life, you have to come to terms with how you feel about it before it goes out into the world. And then once it goes out into the world, seal off, because it doesn't really matter. It's not good for you at that point to invest too much in other people's opinions, whether they like something or dislike it. You have to know how you feel and what you like or dislike about the thing, because it's not healthy for you to get too invested in pleasing other people in this world. If you do that, your life is not your own. So I knew how I felt about it, and I fortunately there was enough time before it came out. And then when it came out, I was pleased to see that a lot of people liked it. I mean, there were criticisms of it too, but I actually, those didn't pierce me, because I already knew how I felt about it, and I thought, oh, that's fine. You and I, speaking to whoever the person was, the reviewer was, you and I probably have different tastes. So what? So it didn't hurt me at all. I felt like I knew what I liked. I know like what I like and dislike about the movie, and I would keep those things to myself, because it's like they're my property. You know what I mean? And it's floated out in the world now, and it's become something else, and it's kind of shocking and amazing to me that it still lives anywhere, It's like it's alive somewhere.
Yeah, film has its own life. I found that fascinating that you didn't know until you watched the films if some of the parts that you'd wrote got into the final cut, and you were like, yes, tick, tick, tick.
Yeah,
You were like, really, that's amazing to hear that story that you were like, yes, I got that scene in. I cared about that scene.
yeah,
That's
exactly.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Um, so did you not go to the premiere in Sundance?
I did go to the premiere in Sundance. Yeah, I was at the premiere, and the really gratifying thing about that was that we were told that Robert Redford, who created Sundance, did not introduce movies often, that he only did that when he really believed in a movie, and that it had been years since he had introduced a movie. And so he introduced the movie. And, I grew up with Robert Redford. I'm sorry. I grew up with Robert Redford. It's like if there was a Robert Redford movie out, my dad got us in the car on the way to see the film. So we were like Robert Redford people. And so the fact that he introduced our movie was a big deal to me. I went to that premiere. I also went to the premiere in Los Angeles, even though at the time I was living in Austin, Texas. I went to the premiere at the Directors Guild. And yeah, so I was at the premieres, and it was always kind of a stunning and surreal experience for me.
What was your favorite scene in the film and why? Now, you said you like to keep some of these things to yourself, so you don't have to answer. But if something stands out, if you have do you have a favorite scene, something that maybe you connect with the most, or
Oh gosh, I don't. Is there something I connect with? Okay, I think that. All right, my favorite bit in the movie is something that I think I discussed with Rick right away on day one, which is a belief of mine. And that is, we're all passing through life, and life has changed. And we don't know if relationships are going to last. We have no control over even, we're going at some point to pass out of this life. And so I believe strongly in the moment. And I think that, and something I've learned in the course of, my travels, is that you may meet someone very special, maybe on a train, and you have a very profound conversation with them, but then you have got to part ways. Even if they were extremely important in your life, they taught you something very crucial, you sometimes have to part ways. So I think of life as preserving moments, and I think that may have been. You asked earlier about the title. I mean, maybe the little space between may possibly have been, now that I'm thinking about it, the working title, because I think I discussed that with Rick right away, that we have these little moments of profound connection, and then we move on because life has changed. And you cannot always guarantee that relationships are going to last, or anything is going to last. We know there's a very good chance they won't. So I love the fact that that was solidified in the story as something important, because I think the whole metaphor of the train and people meeting on the train and then having to make a decision to get off the train and spend a short period of time together and then separate was a big part of what I wanted to convey in the movie.
were there any scenes that you wrote that you loved but they didn't quite make the film, and you're like, oh, I wish that one could have been in there? Do you remember any particular scenes you wrote?
No, I don't remember anything that I was heartbroken about. So I don't think so.
Okay. Okay.
So
When the film was finished, so you had a finished script, you probably had an idea in your mind how the film would be versus the script. Did it match your imagination of how the film would be when you actually got to see it on the screen?
I believe so, because I knew something about Richard Linklater and the sort of movie he liked. I mean, if you've seen Slacker, there's a very European quality to his filmmaking. And I love that sort of story. And I was a literature major. So I like subtlety. I don't need quick edits. I like long conversations. I believe I talked with him about the movie My Dinner with Andre, about these people that have a long conversation. So I think that I was very happy with the feeling of it. And I also felt that Rick understood something about me, because I knew that he liked talking to me and I liked talking with him. And I felt that he got something of me in that story with the pacing, the conversations, the depth of the conversations, the character of Julie, the things they would laugh at, the way they would bring up, say, hot topics like feminism or whatever, but then they would move on quickly, because this was not, they didn't want to waste their time getting angry. They wanted to enjoy their evening together and go a little bit deeper than, ranting and raving about the wrongs in society. He and I think we never did that. So I think that he understood something about me. He said that whenever he saw me, within like a short period of, within a minute, we'd be talking about something heavy. And I felt like, yeah, that's what happens in this movie. And that's what I've been told 1,000 times in my life. So I felt like, oh, he knows me. And so that was cool.
When I was walking around Vienna, I did the kind of traditional thing of trying to find all the movie locations. And I thought to myself, someone 200 years from now could stumble across this film on whatever version of Netflix exists that year. And they could then go to Austria and try to see what's left of these locations.
Wow.
And I thought that was pretty powerful. How do you think the film should be remembered in the context of that era of in time, in terms of like that's the filmmaking and the story? How do you think the film should be remembered to someone that might stumble across this film 200 years from now?
Well, that might answer the question about why the film has lasted, because I think we have these major turning points as human beings. For example, one of the turning points being when we developed language, one of the turning points being when we developed written language, one of the turning points being when we developed the printing press, and many more of us could become literate, and that would pull a bunch of people up out of a certain, being illiterate serfs on somebody else's land. It kind of gives birth to the idea of democracy and the idea that we all have a say and a voice. Well, I think another one of the big turning points was the development of the internet, and the fact that we as individuals we didn't have to be huge media, conglomerates or anything like that. We as individuals could have power. And that happened with the development of the internet. And this movie takes place right before that. And there is a certain romance to the period right before that turning point, because the characters meet and they're not distracted by their electronic devices. They have a real conversation. They have long attention spans. These are things that my students tell me are dying now, which is very interesting. I mean, I don't want to just rip electronic devices, because there's a big plus, obviously, to having electronic devices. Obviously, we're on one right now, but um, the romance of the characters could not share. They did not share their information. And that's just how it was. I mean, when I traveled first on the British Isles and then in Europe, these people that I met, we did not share our information, because why? We were going to be on different continents. And so it was a great experience to meet them and go to a concert or go for a walk, in London or whatever the case would have been. But we were not going to speak or talk or see each other ever again. So we did not share information, and that made the experiences inherently romantic. Romantic, not in the necessarily sex way, but in the old school way of
Yeah,
another
in like the
time.
lifestyle like way.
Yeah, another lifestyle.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
I'll ask you a couple quick questions about the sequel. Between 1995 and 2003, whenever you told someone that you wrote before sunrise, was the first thing they asked you, hey, what happens next? Did people just terrorize you with that question every time or not?
No. I did not hear that. No, I don't think I ever heard that. No, I don't. I think it was one and done.
When Richard mentioned to you about doing a sequel, what was your first reaction to what you thought the answer to that question would be? Did they meet again on December 16th, 1994, or did they not?
I actually was a little bit frightened of the idea of writing a sequel, because so many sequels are a disappointment. And I didn't want to ruin the beautiful thing that we had. It's not that I knew how big that movie would be in the future, but I knew we had something beautiful and I didn't want to wreck it. So my first reaction was, uh-oh, I was a little bit frightened of that. And in the meantime, he made the movie Waking Life, which I was in. And then we sat down and we started working on the sequel. And I remember we bounced around a lot of ideas about how they would get together, whether they would get together. And I I was very wary of wrecking the story, because I know, it's there's some classic movies that are then, unlike, say, The Godfather. I think the sequel is fantastic. But say Rocky, I didn't want to see a classic movie, and I don't know if it was classic to other people at that time, but something that I cared deeply about, I didn't necessarily want to ruin it. That was that was really my main concern, at that point.
You received an Academy Award nomination for Best Adapted Screenplay in 2005 for Before Sunset. How the first film and that film didn't win the awards is a complete mystery to me. However, what was the experience like of going to the Oscars, and who else from the second film was there with you?
Um, well, you know what? It was a lovely thing to go to that event. It was it was very surreal to actually be at the event. There were people there all walking in who I couldn't believe I saw. Mickey Rooney had been the king of MGM Studios in the 30s. He was a young star who had been in vaudeville. And I saw him, and I remember thinking, my God, that's Mickey Rooney. People were lovely, and it was really, really surreal to be there. The, um, the, I the dresses, I was all about looking at those dresses. And we were I was we were in the fourth row, and I was a few down from Oprah Winfrey, who, by the way, I mean, it was really interesting to see Oprah Winfrey. If she strangely, like, she was the same height as me, and she had this amazing gold dress on. So I remember her. Adam Sandler was sitting right in front of me. Drew Barrymore was sitting right in front of me. And I was all agog about the dresses. Chris Rock was the host. and it was a very surreal experience. I ate M&Ms. I remember during the commercial. Oh, and then we we went to the what is called the Governor's Ball afterward, which is a ball for all of the nominees, and it is a gorgeous, gorgeous event where they serve you this incredible dinner, and they have someone singing, and it was a gorgeous thing. I had a few actors who I really admired come up to me to introduce themselves. Laura Linney, who I absolutely love. Laura Linney, do you remember her performance she did this performance in a movie called The Savages that I think is genius, and I also love her in Love Actually. God, she's good. Anyway, I talked with her for a minute, and lovely, lovely person. So I have these snippets that are really great and meaningful. It's very interesting to see how tall people are. You would never believe the heights. Like people you think are really tall, or sometimes not tall, people you think who are, I mean, it's funny. I wrote a recent commercial for Chanel, which was with Brad Pitt and Penelope Cruz. And Brad Pitt is tall. And I didn't know that, but he's tall and slim. And I wasn't expecting that, but he was well over 6 feet tall. So you don't know how tall people are going to be.
Yeah, people always look different on television, right? Last question on Before Sunset. You mentioned on Popcorn Talk that you had a finished script when Richard kind of first came to you about doing the sequel, and you'd worked on a script quite diligently for a while. And then things started to change and the actors wanted to get a bit more involved. How did the story go, if you are allowed to say, in your version of the sequel before it got kind of changed by the actors, if you will?
I brought in some elements that were removed. Like, for example, we met Celine's parents. We showed more aspects of the ensuing relationship with Celine and Jesse. So the story was shortened. And if you've noticed, the sequel is short. I cannot remember the amount of the number of minutes or the amount of pages, but it was shortened because
both films are actually quite short.
Yeah. So it was shortened, and those scenes were just taken out of the story.
You've written various books, and I know you've been teaching for a long time now at UCLA and now at El Camino. How did you fall into teaching, and how are you helping people outside of the college system
We're having
teaching?
an earthquake. Hold on.
Oh my God. Okay.
Did you see that?
Life in California.
Yeah.
I saw the screen move.
Yeah, we had an earthquake. Hold on just a sec. Let me look at the phone and see if, let me see if this is, hold on. I'm going to get a message in a sec about an earthquake. Hold on just a sec.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Woo! That was a big one. You okay?
Really? Okay.
Yeah, that was a big one. Okay.
I'm okay. I think you're
quick. I'm probably going to get
okay, I'll read you the question.
Okay.
All right. You've written various books, and I know you've been teaching for a long time now at UCLA and now at El Camino. Outside of teaching people face-to-face, I see that you're doing work on Patreon. Can you talk a little bit more about how you're helping people to write?
Okay. Well, so I was an English major, and the funny thing is that after Rick and I filmed Dazed and Confused, I actually started teaching literature at a college in Austin. And so it's one of those things where maybe life imitated art, but I did actually become a teacher, and I adored teaching literature and writing. And when I came out to, oh, and I also started teaching screenwriting because I had a screenplay that got made. And so when I came out to Los Angeles, where I'm from, by the way, I came back to Los Angeles. I, you need a day job when you're a writer because writing is very inconsistent. You don't know when things are going to go. You're going to get paid. You're going to get the job. You just don't know. There's an inconsistency. But I also adore teaching. And I get a lot of satisfaction from teaching. And so it keeps me in touch with people, and I especially love teaching young people. So I began teaching at UCLA and other schools. And then the thing that really got me teaching on Patreon was that on my phone, people kept asking me questions about screenwriting. And this went on and on until I finally was like, you know what? I need to create some sort of online class so that I can just direct people to my online little classes. And so I have this very low cost writing sanctuary called the Magic Hour on Patreon. So if you go to patreon.com/Kim Krizan, I have writing prompts. A lot of them have to do with screenwriting or just creativity in writing. And that basically was just an outgrowth of people asking me to pass along my writing method. So that's how that happened on Patreon. I'm still a little shaky from the earthquake. Only one thing fell. A picture came down off the shelf back there, but nothing else fell. So okay. Usually we have aftershock.
Hopefully nothing broke. Nothing broke.
No, nothing broke.
Yeah,
Everything
I was about to say.
Nothing broke, but that was a big one. Okay. Usually we have these little tremors, but that was a big one, and I'm expecting it to come on my feed in a second, but it's not up yet, so it wasn't so horrible that they did an emergency thing,
How do people get in touch with you if they want to learn about writing, if they want to just see more about your content, about the work you're doing, because obviously you're writing books and you're quite active. Where's the best place for people to connect with you?
Well, okay, if they go on Instagram and find me as Kim Krizan, so it's KIMKRIZAN, the link in my bio will take them to my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Kim Krizan, and the name of my writing sanctuary is The Magic Hour. But otherwise, follow me on Patreon, and I post writing tips sometimes. That's where I met you, right? And so I post things about movies sometimes, or writing tips or whatever. Maybe I'll post the earthquake that we just experienced.
So, Kim, I want to thank you so much for, first of all, writing such a great film, which impacted so many people, and for taking the time to answer all my questions that I've always wondered about the film. So thank you so much. To follow Kim, I would put a link in the description for the video. Make sure you follow her on Instagram. And if you want to learn more about writing, make sure you join with her on Patreon, and you can learn from Academy nominee.
It's such a pleasure talking
to you, Kim,
Simon.
for your time today.
Such a pleasure talking to you, Simon. And I wish you the best of luck with your podcast. So really a pleasure. Thank you very much.